JoAnn Falletta, there could be no finer advocate than yourself for the music of Jerome Moross. I have long prized two marvellous CDs of his music with you conducting, the First Symphony, and on that recording a piece that I particularly want to talk about with you, that marvellous and almost unknown, tragically, ballet The Last Judgement, but also on the other CD, Frankie and Johnny, such an original masterpiece. Now, you have captured in all these performances so much the essence of the music of Jerome Moross, and in particular the Last Judgement, the ambiguous, elusive colours of this extraordinarily original work. I think it's wonderful the way these come across in your performance, but also with the First Symphony and with Frankie and Johnny. And it's particularly important that you have recorded and are advocating the Last Judgement. I think the Last Judgement really is a masterpiece, and it has a masterly performance from yourself and the London Symphony Orchestra.
Well, thank you. I think you're right. The symphony stands as on its own as a concert piece, so perhaps that's a little bit easier to program. But the Last Judgement and Frankie and Johnny are so filled with references to action, and dancing, that perhaps on the stage people don't always realize the wit and the humor and the story behind what's happening. But the music itself is so creative, so inventive, and truly unique. I mean, this is a man who has an American voice that is completely his own. Of course, informed by the people he worked with, the people he admired, like Copland and Bernard Herrmann. But somehow he had a way of writing music that was innate and specific to him and absolutely filled with charm.
Yes, and that wit and charm comes through in the interviews that we have on our programme. When Jerome Moross was giving interviews over a period of time, he always came across with very great elegance and charm and wit, and a gentle kind of wit. It's rather interesting to me that in the music, particularly of The Last Judgement, I find so much of his real personality there. Of course, in Frankie and Johnny, we have a much more caustic kind of situation and a very powerful drama, but always encased in this wonderful urbanity, it seems to me. And this, again, I feel is captured wonderfully in your performances. I've got a little theory. I wonder what you think. And there are some other people I've put this to who are appearing in our programme who some of them have not agreed with me, but this is my little theory. See what you think. You see, I think that, of course, we hear Americana in Jerome Moross's music, undoubtedly. Absolutely. But I feel that some of his real personality, some of his charm, and some of his elusiveness, some of his strange, almost macabre warmth that there is sometimes in this music, I feel that this could be something in his genetic roots that goes back to his Russian Jewish origins. Of course, he was born in the United States, but the family, of course, was Russian Jewish. And I feel possibly something of that in the personality sometimes in the music, a little bit, shall we say, under the skin. And, well, I feel that subtlety comes out wonderfully in your performances, but maybe I'm dreaming. What do you think?
You might be onto something with the fact that it perhaps goes back to his genetic roots, because, yes, he's thoroughly American, but there's a kind of wildness I found in the music. There's a kind of drama and unexpected twists and turns that are surprising and delightful and filled with color that we don't often hear in other American composers. That's why I've never heard anything quite like his music, and it's really a tragedy that people don't know it. Hopefully now, with the anniversary, we might be able to spread the word a little bit about this fantastic American voice.
Yes, and you are particularly fulfilling a very important role yourself this year, because you're giving some performances of Jerome Moross's music to mark the centenary.
Well, we're doing the symphony with the Buffalo Philharmonic, and that was the one that Susanna is most anxious to have performed on the concert stage. I suppose for any composer, a symphony looms large in their opus, as something special. And interestingly, although Moross wrote for a wide variety of genre, he always considered himself a concert composer first. I mean, I think that was where his heart really lay. And so the fact that the symphony to Susanna is an expression of who he was at his most serious, at his most classical, and perhaps at his most, the kind of work that he would himself value most, although the rest of his output is so totally engaging and filled with a kind of innate liveliness and unself-consciousness and just uninhibited fun, and beautifully orchestrated as well. But we will be doing the symphony as a celebration of the anniversary.
I know that he took great pleasure in writing the symphony, and in particular, this was because it was a work that for him expressed his love of form and architecture. Actually, he was enormously disciplined in all his writing, wasn't he? In all the music he wrote, in terms of the form and the architecture. He felt very strongly about this, and I think it's a very important part of his music that, of course, does need particular control in the performances to bring it off in the way that he really intended.
Well, I think he had a very strong sense of architecture. I don't know how much of that was a natural gift that he had, or how much he actually analyzed what he was doing in terms of architecture. But the tightly knit quality and the formal structure of these pieces, side by side with the kind of free, expressive nature of the work, is an irresistible combination. So for me, form is very important, because that is at the basis of the success of a piece of music, because the audience listening has to perceive a sense of rightness. They have to perceive a sense of architecture, of a kind of balance and structure that makes sense to them. And they have to do that, of course, all with their ears, which is quite a challenge for the performer. But of course, it helps if the composer himself has a gift for that, has a gift for understanding the pacing and the construction of a piece of music. And he really did. What's amazing to me is that largely he was self-taught. I mean, he was self-taught as a composer, which I suppose is interesting. He studied formally theory, of course, and analysis and the classical forms. But in terms of his own voice, that was his. He never actually studied composition with a composition teacher who might have pointed him in a completely different direction. But he did spend a lot of time studying counterpoint and the formal structure of symphonic movements, for instance. And even though his are quite original, I mean, to start a symphony with the theme and variations form is not often done, it works. And the last movement, this fugue, which again is his own take on a fugue, creates a piece of tremendous momentum and excitement and structure that really works. I mean, at the end of the symphony, you're really overwhelmed by the power of what you've heard.
Yes, indeed. And despite the, should we say, very strong architectural form, you've just very importantly analysed for us the element of freedom, unexpectedness and creativity, which at the end of the day is what hits us, but reinforced, as you've said, by the form, making it a stronger experience. But he wasn't he, JoAnn, a remarkably individualistic composer. Once again, I say, yes, we hear him as an American artist, Americana, and yet it's just Jerome Moross. I don't know any other composer who sounds like him. Incredibly original, creative ideas.
He was an original, I mean, and remarkable, exactly, because he was able to use this formal structure in a way that never diminished at all his originality or his inventiveness. He was able to be himself, but yet always keep in the back of his mind what he'd learned, which is amazing. I mean, it's a kind of a genius, because just his knowledge of music must have been extraordinary, and that it's just incredible to think about that. You know, I'm sorry I never met him personally, because I think from his music I get the sense that he would have been a very charming and funny man, because his music is that way. His music is filled with humor and, a little bit of satire and kind of self-deprecation in some ways, and in a charming way, and great strength besides. And I guess I was speculating when I first came to know his music 20 years ago, speculating why why more orchestras don't know of him. I suppose that he was under the stigma that so many people suffered from, and that is when you wrote for film, or you wrote for the stage, or you wrote for, if you wrote for an American vernacular, let's say, you were not taken as seriously, especially at a certain point in the 20th century where to be a composer meant to write music that was frankly inaccessible to most audiences. And he, I'm sure, would never have gone in that direction, because to him, it seems to me that music was communication on the highest level with every part of the American vernacular and every individual idea that he had. He would never have followed the path of music being difficult for the sake of being difficult. But I think that he might have suffered from that. I mean, he did not belong to the group that was the right group to be in, I suppose, at a time. Plus, he had the job with films, which I think made for a lot of people love to put composers in boxes as a serious composer or a stage composer or a concert composer or not. And sometimes I'm so sorry. I think how frustrating it must have been for him to have suffered through that.
Yes, he's not the only one who suffered in that way. There has been, and even to this day, I think remains some really extraordinary prejudice about people who've composed for films. And actually, if we look back at history, well, many of the very greatest composers were outstanding film composers. Look at Prokofiev and look at Shostakovich for a start. And the element in the films that I suppose was particularly important for the film companies was his melodic gift. And you hear this not only in the films, we hear it in virtually all his music. He had such an extraordinarily inventive, original turn of melody.
He did. I think he was very much involved with melodic and rhythmic impulse in music and used the orchestration to serve that, but often in unexpected ways, in ways that are surprising and delightful. And no one else quite orchestrates the way he does. And you get the feeling, listening to his music, that he was comfortable with who he was as a musician and as a composer. He wasn't trying to be anyone else. He was, of course, developing and experimenting, but it had more to do with studying music and studying his own accomplishments and how he could make music more communicative, more informative, more able to reach the public. There's a certain ease there, and there's a certain just lovableness in terms of his music. And I think that was recognized when he was a young man. I mean, we have wonderful comments by Copland, for instance, and Herman as well, just expressing their opinion that this was someone really very special. And I imagine in the middle part of his life and later part of his life, he was caught in that kind of really dreadful situation where if you were not writing music that was esoteric and mentally challenging and absolutely unlikable in most cases, you were not in the in group. And I think he probably didn't care at all about not being in the in-group. But it is a tragedy for us because we don't know his music, and he might have been encouraged and commissioned to write more had that not been the case, had people not made those unfair judgments or composers made unfair judgments of other composers. Even now, the tragedy is that when I mention his name to people and they don't know it, there's a subtle assumption that, well, if we don't know it, then I guess it wasn't of a quality that should be recognized. And nothing could be further than the truth. I mean, this is music that is vibrant, it's unique, it's totally engaging without being simple in the least. I mean, it's music of complexity, but in the best sense, complexity that just communicates and enlivens and fascinates too. And that's the tragedy, that we would have had more of it had he been living in a time when needless labels were applied to composers who did work for film or for the stage.
And also the ironic fact that those composers who were being pushed at this time, who were completely outside melody, with the exception, of course, of the few very important great ones, but so many of them who were particularly à la mode in the 1940s, 50s and 1960s, so many of them are almost forgotten today now.
Yes, Yes. No, it's true. It's most of the composers who were pronouncing other composers as not being serious composers are no longer heard or played because their music simply doesn't have the structure, the power, the communication that audiences in the end want. And I think it's unfair that was perpetrated on so many wonderful composers. Even Bernstein, who of course has given us an amazing output, would have written perhaps more freely and with less self-consciousness maybe if he realized that it wasn't necessary to be an intellectual composer, that one could write melodically and rhythmically and engagingly, and in the end, that's what it's all about.
Well, that is so right, what you say. And here we are with the centenary now, and we here at the WFMT Radio Network feel very passionately about restoring some knowledge about Jerome Moross to the music-loving public, because his works, they do not date. Now, in particular, let's have a look at Frankie and Johnny. Now, I'm amazed when I hear this piece that this was written at the end of the 1930s. It has never dated. It retains its enormously powerful psychological and dramatic thrust. And in many ways, I feel that it's 15 or 20 years ahead of its time. It expresses a kind of relentless angst that came about maybe in some of Bernstein's music in the 1950s. I think this is a most remarkably original and important piece.
Yes. Well, this is an amazing piece. I think Frankie and Johnny is truly a classic. It's an American classic, and it's very strong. It's like a great American novel in a way, what he's writing, his music here, or a great poem. It is gritty. I mean, sometimes it's gritty, sometimes it's poignant, but it's so real, and it explores, a story from the seamier side of the American vernacular, I suppose, but with such fierceness and such love at the same time. I mean, you can tell that he is into this. I mean, he believes in the power of this ballet, and he also, and I thought this strikes me too with Last Judgement. I think he had a certain special sympathy for women, and I don't know whether I just am imagining this, but it seemed to me that in his portrayal of Frankie and in his portrayal of Eve in The Last Judgement, there's a kind of special attention play to the power of women and the fact that maybe they haven't always been treated fairly. And I think to myself, what an interesting man he must have been to at that time to give a little special attention to the women villainesses, I suppose I should say, but not in his hands. I mean, he makes them interesting, strong, engaging, and in the end, lovable people.
I think so. Yes, I really think so. And in the interviews we hear some of this. We hear his gentle but strong advocacy, I think, of women. And I'm glad you mentioned The Last Judgement again there, because I really do think that's such a marvellous piece and such a wonderful performance you've got there from the orchestra, from the London Symphony Orchestra. It's got great suggestiveness and wit, strength, and also, as I said earlier on, elusiveness. And I just love that music so much. And then another work you've recorded, which is so different, of course, is A Tall Story. Now, this music that really originated when he went to the west coast of the United States for the first time, I think it's got the most extraordinary feeling of, when I say otherworldliness, that's probably not terribly intelligent of me to say that, but it feels almost like a kind of dream after one has had a marvellous experience of nature in some way. And this takes us into an almost timeless kind of world, a very different musical language.
Yes, yes. Oh, this is very personal to him. I think this Tall Story, it was the experience he had of crossing the country and discovering, as an Easterner, discovering the American West and being just dazzled by it and trying to create that vista, that landscape that so moved him in his language, but in a different way. That he treats this in such a beautiful, beautiful, expansive way. Again, another facet of his work, but equally compelling, I think. It's very, very wonderful writing. And and communicative again, reaching people, telling them something about a place that he loves. And was very open with people, I think, for a complex man, willing so much to share who he was with the audience and willing to converse with them in a way. And I mean, that's how I know him, only through his music, because as I said, I never had the great privilege of knowing him personally. But through his music, I feel like I have a kind of relationship with this extraordinarily engaging person who's very complicated, and nothing he writes is rote. Nothing he writes is pat in any way. I mean, as we talked about, his portrayal of women is enormously complex and sympathetic and rather biting at the same time. This is a man who was a very, very deep person, and I must tell you too, when we did these recordings in London and in New Zealand, both times I was struck with the enthusiasm of the orchestra. You know, these are orchestras that record a great deal, of course, and they record all kinds of music, and they come to know it during the recording session, so you can actually see through their body language, through their enthusiasm, how they're feeling about the music as it's unfolding, as they're playing it. And I could just see the delight and the true enjoyment that these musicians were having playing it. And in a way, that's the real test of the measure of this music, that performers love to play it and are continually intrigued by what they're doing. And I saw it so clearly in London and New Zealand.
And the originality. I'm sure that this inventive originality particularly appealed to the musicians. And I think his music, don't you, JoAnn, stands on its own, even outside its context. We have on this programme some versions of his very famous Lazy Afternoon from The Golden Apple. Now, that's been recorded, I think, over 170 times. And, of course, they're all incredibly different. And I said to one of the people who's appearing in this programme, who's actually singing Lazy Afternoon, I said, well, don't you think the interesting thing is that this music, even if you don't know the context of The Golden Apple, as you should really know the context to understand the song, but the music stands on its own even outside that context, it seems to me. That is kind of, I think, a special element in Jerome Moross's music, that it can express its real self, even on its own, outside the conditions from which it arose. And in a sort of way, it may sound a bit kind of convoluted what I'm saying, but in a way that's very, very important, that it should be able to survive in that way.
Well, I think that's what he would have wanted. I would think that every composer has the hope that the music stands by itself and reveals something that goes beyond words. And his music certainly does. And it's not necessary to know about his life. And the little I knew about his life came from Susanna, who of course was seeing him as a daughter, as a young girl growing up in the midst of her father, making his way through the music world. And that's a certain perspective. But the music itself tells a powerful story that perhaps we can't psychoanalyze, but there's something so human about it, so human and so likable, and just so filled with goodwill and humor and a kind of savvy too. I mean, this was a man who really knew the world around him and loved it. No, despite all of its quirks and bumps, really loved people and loved the world.
Well, in all that you have said in this very valuable interview, as well as in all that you have brought to lovers of music through your marvellous performances, I think you have an ideal understanding of Jerome Moross, both as a musician and as a man. It's really been particularly delightful to share this extraordinary artist with you, and I'd like to thank you enormously for all you've done on his behalf. Your recordings are very important. They're superbly played. They're ideally interpreted. And we are going to be including them, of course, on this documentary. JoAnn Falletta, thank you so much for giving us your time today. It's been really very enlightening to discuss Jerome Moross with you in his centenary year.
Thank you, John.